This is my Toshiba Libretto 50 CT, and its hard drive is having a hard time. So I need to reinstall Windows 98 on a system without a CD or floppy drive. There is an easy way to do this by copying the files over to the new hard drive, but there's an additional thing you can do beyond that to turn an all hard drive install into a completely unattended near OEM install. So today, I'm going to show you how you can create your own bootstrap image of Windows 98 that you can write to the hard drive for any machine to massively simplify the install. This is going to use the Windows 98 batch tool. This is a program included on the retail Windows 98 CD that allows you to pre-configure a Windows 98 installer before you run setup. You must have a working install to run this program though, and it will actually be easiest to install a fresh copy of Windows 98 to do this because it will make it a lot easier and more obvious what all of the settings are you're going to need to configure. To do this, I'm going to be using 86box on Linux. This will allow me to work with raw disk images for the hard drives, which will be very useful later. And the Linux tools available will make putting this onto the real hardware easier. This should be possible from Windows or Mac as well, but you will need a tool for resizing partitions later. Now, the only files we need to start this process are the retail install media for Windows 98. I'm using 2nd edition here. You then need to set up a Windows 98 compatible machine in 86box. I have a whole video about 86box if you want to know more about how this software works. Since that video, they've added this handy machine manager tool, which is very nice. Aside from being capable of running Windows 98, the critical settings for this project are to make sure you enable a hard drive controller, add a CD-ROM drive, and configure a 1.44 megabyte floppy drive. And during this, we're going to do the first real step of this process, making a hard disk image. And make sure to use the raw image type. I'm going to recommend you make a 1 gigabyte or 1024 megabyte image for this. This is the smallest common size I've found. Will make the Windows 98 format tool automatically use FAT32. Smaller sizes will default to FAT16. Later we will have to expand this partition using external software, and frustratingly, we almost didn't have to. Windows 98 comes with a tool for converting FAT16 partitions to FAT32, but it doesn't resize them after, so it's useless for us. 1 gigabyte is a good size though, because you can include some extra stuff later. Once you have all of that set up and have your hard disk image made, you're ready to save and boot the machine. You may need to configure the BIOS of the emulated machine to boot correctly, but once it can, you should mount the Windows 98 CD and possibly boot floppy if your system can't boot from the CD. The first step is going to be using fdisk to create a new partition on the drive that uses the full size. After the required reboot, we need to format the new C drive. You need to change to the Windows 98 folder on the CD to access its format tool. We're going to format C with the /S option, which will copy the basic system files that will make the drive bootable, which we will need later. After that finishes, you can label it whatever you want, and we can change over to the C drive for the first time and verify that the system files like command-com were copied. Next, we're going to make a folder on the drive called Win98 and change into it. Now we can go back to the CD drive, and I will point out that both drives are currently in a Win98 folder. We can now copy the files with *** to C:, which will use the current path of the C drive as the destination. This may take a little bit of time to do in your emulated machine, but it is one of the most important steps. Once that copy finishes, we're ready to move on to phase 2 of this process. With your drive formatted, a system installed, and the Windows 98 directory copied over, you have everything you need to do a basic hard drive-only install of Windows 98. But we need to save a copy of this drive state before we continue. So go ahead and shut down the machine by closing the window, and I'm going to make a copy of our current hard drive into a folder called Hold. We need a copy because we will be using this again later. After that has been backed up, we can boot the emulated machine again. Once you're at the DOS prompt, go ahead and change into the Win98 folder on the hard drive and run setup.exe. It's important to point out here that there is a huge benefit to installing Windows 98 from a hard drive directly like this, particularly for machines without removable media. After the install, this will configure the source path registry property to search for cwin98 for the cab files that contain all of the extra Windows 98 drivers, which means you will never need to put the CD in again to install new hardware. Back to the install, you'll need to go through the standard Windows 98 install process. I would recommend that you configure this install as a sort of base for how you want all future Windows 98 installs to be configured, though you don't have to. This mostly matters after the install when we're configuring our batch setup process, but this is where you can add or remove programs included with the install. A basic list of changes I usually make are enabling all accessibility tools, enable all of the fun accessories, remove address book and Outlook, disable all networking features, disable the weird web server, remove the defunct ISP advertising, and add the system monitoring tools. Disabling networking might sound weird, but if you aren't going to use it, it's better to not have it because it fundamentally changes the Windows 98 boot process and will make you go through a login screen every time. This isn't Windows 11, and we're still allowed to configure stuff like that. After that, you can skip through all the remaining options pretty quickly, and then it will copy all of the files, which can take a while depending on how well your computer emulates this machine. There will be a reboot, which will then ask you to enter your product key, then in a moment ask you to set your time zone. It'll go through the usual process of automatically detecting and installing some drivers, reboot, do more driver detection, and eventually start up the desktop. We're finally ready to get to the really cool stuff now. From my computer, you need to explore the Windows 98 CD and navigate to Tools ResKit Batch. This contains the installer that will allow us to automate the setup process. Run setup, install the program, and we are immediately ready to run it from the Start menu. This is now roughly phase 2.5 of the install. The batch program is used to generate an INF file that you can pass as a parameter to the Windows setup program that has all of the options that it will ask about pre-configured. The reason that I recommend you to install this install of Windows 98 and the same one as the one you want to put on your target machine is that you can simply click the Gather Now button to pull in all of these settings that you use for this install. The full setup does a much better job of explaining what all of the options are than this does, which makes it a lot easier to know what you are doing. But you can still configure them hereafter if you prefer. Now, one thing that is super handy in the general setup options is the ability to pre-enter your product key. After this, I'm actually planning to use this to make a custom ISO of my Windows 98 copy that has an INF file with my key pre-entered and no other settings enabled, so I just don't have to type it in every time from now on. But today I'm focusing more on creating the kind of drive image that would be preloaded onto a new OEM computer. Now, I would recommend you poke around this menu and take a look at the different settings that you can change. There are some interesting ones like changing what desktop icons there are, and if you're using networking, you can pre-configure a proxy, which would be great coupled with Wayback Proxy. But there is one thing in the setup prompts that you probably want to check because it won't have trip during the 86-box install relating to PCMCIA cards. I didn't enable this for my install, and we will see this in a moment. Once you've looked at everything, you can go ahead and save the settings to an INF file, and you've now created your custom automated install config. Now we need that disk image we made a copy of earlier because we want to put this file on it to enable our minimal set of files to install automatically. Before you do that though, you may want to make a quick bat file that just runs c win98 setup.exe pointed at the file en route to simplify the install. I'm naming this file setup, but you could also name it autoexe.bat and it would automatically start when you boot the image to be even more automated. Now, to get the INF and bat file onto the old hard drive image, you could mount it as a second drive and just copy it from Windows 98, but I'm going to make a floppy disk image, format it, and then copy the files to that instead. After this is done, I would recommend shutting off this virtual computer and then make another copy of the hard drive image to be able to generate a new batch file later if you want. I'm then going to overwrite the image the emulated machine is booting with the non-installed one and reboot it. From here, I just have to copy the INF and BAT from the floppy to the root of the C drive, and the entire process is now done. I'm going to replace my old copy of this drive with it in its current state because this is now the fully prepared automatic Windows install image. You can even try this out in 86-box by running the BAT or directly running the win98 setup.exe program pointed at the INF file. You'll see how the different dialog options pop up but are immediately dismissed as it uses the options from the file. But I would rather take the setup back to my real machine to show this in action, although there are some more complications. I'm going to be using an IDE emulator and an SD card for the hard drive on the Toshiba. I can connect the SD card into my computer and see that it has whatever other random data on it. The first thing I'm going to do is use DD on Linux to write my bootstrapped Windows 98 image to the card directly. This will overwrite the partition table and copy over all of the data. Once it's done, I can unplug and replug the card and we can see the C drive contents on it. But I'm using a 32GB card, and this is only a 1GB partition, so we need to expand it. Now there are tools to do this on the target machine like Partition Magic, but the whole point of this is that I'm using a computer that can't easily boot anything, and even if I could, it would probably be very slow if I did it on the target machine. So I'm just going to use gparted on Linux to do this. It couldn't be any easier. Just open the card with it, right-click the partition to resize, drag the end over to fill the drive, and hit apply. Bam! done. If you're curious why I don't use the KDE partition manager since I'm on Kubuntu, it actually can't resize FAT32 partitions for some reason. But now, if I reconnect the SD card and open it, I can see I have 30-ish gigs free, and it's ready to go. If you had any particular drivers or software that you needed on your target computer, now would be a great time to copy them over, but I'm just going plain for my setup here. Now, let's finally install Windows 98 on this tiny laptop. One of the reasons for going through all this trouble is how much of a nightmare it is to get an SD adapter like this installed. The original hard drive has a nice handle on it, but I kind of just have to drop the SD IDE down in there and then carefully align it with some tools to plug it in. With that pain in the butt over with, I'm going to connect this to this super handy little VGA dock that I was sent so I can capture output from this computer. Takes a while for the backlight to get up to a reasonable brightness, and filming this tiny screen would be miserable anyway. The capture is a little soft. I think the signal path through the dock isn't great. But now I can start up the computer and it will boot into the minimal system. From here, I can start the setup. It's going to ask for a username, have you agree to the license and confirm the product key, but after that, it is fully automated to the point where I went off to have lunch and let it do its thing. It did pop up that PCMCIA dialog that I warned about, but after that, the rest of the install was completely hands-off. There was one more dialog after it was done about setting up a password that I skipped, but then it was ready. And it even got the sound card working out of the box. And that is the entire process of how you can create a nearly OEM-like hard drive image that automatically installs and configures Windows 98, which is particularly helpful for weird machines like this. Now, there are a few parameters that I didn't mention that you can add to the bat file to potentially automate this a little more, but that's most of the main information that you'll want to know about. Hopefully you found that useful, and if you did, you may want to subscribe to be notified when I release future videos. If you want to help support the channel, I am on Patreon, but for now that's it, and I will see you next time.